I think all the publications in Bridgetower, and we have business vertical, we have construction vertical, we have legal vertical, we have home furnishings. All of these are really parts of the community. We all see ourselves as, we're not newspapers, we're not just publications, but we do events, we put on programs, we provide thought leadership. And if you think of us that way, as that we're part of the community with you, Lawyers Weekly is part of the community here in Boston, and in all the other states we have Lawyers Weekly papers. And think about it, to go back to something I said earlier, as working with us. That we're partners. Yes, we have clients. Yes, we have advertisers, but we see it as a partnership and we see us as working together so everybody's successful.
Welcome to On Record PR, where we go on record with industry leaders to discuss best practices for public relations strategies that drive business success. Let's get started with the show.
Welcome to On Record PR. I'm your host, Gina Rubel. Today I'm going on record with Susan Bocamazo, the Managing Director of Bridgetower Media. She is a graduate of Providence College and Harvard Law School and practiced in the litigation department of Testa, Hurwitz and Thibeault in Boston before originally joining Lawyers Weekly as a news writer. I'm pretty sure, Susan, that's where we met some years ago.
That is, back in the Lawyers USA days, definitely.
Yes, Lawyers USA. Mm-hmm. So now you serve as the managing director for Bridgetower Media's legal vertical, which encompasses legal brands in Massachusetts, Virginia, Missouri, Michigan, North and South Carolina, and Rhode Island. Did I miss anything?
Nope, that's everybody.
And you have 20 years of experience in the rapidly changing media industry, adapting to the reader's changing expectations, which happens daily, and this idea of a digital first world. So I'm excited to bring your expertise in all business areas, including community outreach, content strategy, and organizational performance to our listeners. So welcome, Susan, to On Record PR.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And it's been so fun knowing you over these many years, but also with both of us witnessing how much the media industry has changed as the world has changed.
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit about your history in legal reporting and publishing, and so our listeners can learn more about your experience.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I have a law degree. I practiced for a couple of years in Boston at a firm that isn't there anymore. And I came to Lawyers Weekly. I started out as a reporter. And then over time, I moved into an editor position. And then I was the publisher of the newspaper that you knew me from, Lawyers USA, which was a national paper for small firm attorneys. And then about a dozen years ago, I made the jump to Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly, which is one of the leading legal brands at Bridgetower Media. Originally, I made the change because I was looking for a way to use my law degree that wasn't necessarily practice. And what was appealing to me was that unlike the practice of law, where you develop an expertise in something somewhat narrow, being a reporter, I could learn a little bit about a lot of things. And so one week I might be writing about ERISA compliance, and another week it might be family law. And I found that to be really fun. And that's one of the really fun things about legal journalism is every day is different because you're reporting on what happens. And so what is important to lawyers at any given point in time, what's changing in terms of their practice changes over time. And so what were the issues 20 years ago aren't the issues now. And that's what's kept it very fresh.
We have that in common. That's why I love being on the agency side of legal consulting in public relations, crisis, and marketing, because there's something new every day. I'm never bored.
No, you're never bored.
So it begs the question, though, and now as a lawyer, and both of us have our law degrees, we both practiced. So we tend to have a pretty good understanding of the basic information that we need to understand what an attorney is working on, or a case or a matter. But how can our listeners share information? Let's say, for example, it's a new practice area that you're not familiar with. How can they be a great resource to you to help you come up to speed quickly, especially when it's a breaking story?
So we find, and I think this is true for a lot of organizations now, as news organizations have become leaner and meaner. But in my vertical, which are all the legal brands, we get an enormous number of story ideas from sources, from people picking up the phone or sending an email and saying, this is something you really should know about. And when I first stepped into the role, I think there was a real misconception. I would be out and about, I'd meet attorneys and they'd say, oh, I have this incredibly interesting case. I don't know who to tell. I said, well, you should tell me. But the point is that, don't hesitate to pick up the phone and contact that particular publication if you think it's going to be of interest to them. Don't assume that we can't be in every courthouse, we can't go to every hearing, but we get an enormous amount of story ideas from someone either emailing the editor, reaching out to a reporter, and we try to be out and about in the community. So you're going to meet us. And those relationships are really the way. If you've got something that, that's how it really is very reciprocal. We need our readers just as much as they need us. They provide us with information. They tell us what we need to care about. They tell us what matters to lawyers, and then we provide it to the more general bar. So if you think of it in those terms, that we're working together, I think that's really the best way to approach it.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I'm always counseling clients to develop the relationship before the need.
I think that's exactly right. If you know the reporter and they know you, go out for a cup of coffee, and then when you reach out and say, I think this is really interesting, Susan, I know you, I know you're trustworthy, and I take you at your word.
So tell us, in this new digital first arena, tell me a little bit about, or the listeners really, about what deadlines mean to you.
So the concept of deadline has definitely shifted over time, right? It used to be, it was all tied to the production of the print product. And so we're weekly still in Massachusetts. And so every week there's a certain date that would be the cutoff. And that's when reporters would write their story. Deadlines have tightened up a lot. And so while you will still find that if someone's writing an article for a magazine, and some of our pubs are magazines or a newspaper, they might have sort of a couple days to work on it. But a lot of times it's a lot more pressing than that. And so if a reporter reaches out to you and they're working on a breaking story, they really need you to talk to them pretty much right away. And if you call back in 2 days, you're really going to have missed that opportunity. On the flip side, if you are pitching a story, you don't want to say to the reporter, well, I actually can't talk about this for 3 weeks. That's not really the time frame that we work in anymore. It has to be, everything is a little more immediate than it used to be.
What drives that? And I'm getting at the competitiveness, obviously, of why getting that story out there is important for you to get it out there quickly.
The competitiveness, as you said, it's a little less so for us because we're not part of the general media where there's all these different outlets. The information in a business-to-business publication that you provide, there's probably less competition, but there's some. And in fact, the local daily newspaper might have a lot of legal coverage, for example. And we don't want the local paper to get it before we do because we're Lawyers Weekly. So that's certainly part of it. And now we're almost like a daily in a lot of respects, whereas it used to be, oh, we're weekly, news only comes out weekly. That's not really true anymore. And between the website and the daily alert, we're almost as much of a daily as your traditional daily newspaper.
Well, especially with anything that's breaking. So how can our listeners plan the best way to handle media inquiries in their event that they're contacted by a reporter?
Well, I think the best way to do that is to give it some thought ahead of time. So give some thought before the reporter calls of how you're going to field those kind of requests so you don't panic in the moment. Give some thought to, is there going to be a designated person? Do you have a PR or marketing person that you have to go through? Some law firms, they want the lawyer to not speak, but to reach out to who the contact is. Have a plan for what you're going to need to ask the reporter. What's your deadline? Can you give me a sense of what you want to talk about? When do you need me to get back to you? And then schedule a time to talk. And keep in mind that it may have to be a pretty short time frame.
And I think that's a really important thing when you say plan what you're going to say. And I want to share a tip because it's something we're seeing now in the media with a lot of the SCOTUS decisions coming down, in particular, the affirmative action decision. And I'm not going to get into the affirmative action decision, but a lot of law firms have very robust diversity programs, but they're not thinking about how they're going to respond to media queries in the event that, for example, they're subject to a lawsuit, because we very recently saw 2 lawsuits come down with 2 top law firms in the country related to the affirmative action decision. So the clients we represent, for example, already have responses drawn up in the event that the media calls, because they have robust diversity programs. Their DE&I. And the reason I give that example are there are many times that the attorneys can anticipate, whether it be for the firm or for a particular matter. If they know a matter is going to be coming to completion in the next few weeks and it's high profile, for example, or there's something big happening in their community with civil rights and they're going to get a phone call, those types of responses can be drafted well in advance of getting a phone call from a reporter.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, you know what you're working on, and you know what's coming up in your local legal community, the decisions that are expected. And if that's your case and there's going to be a verdict soon, you want to give some thought to what you're going to say. Exactly.
Yeah. And as a PR person, I love when we get the call from the attorney that says, I got a great decision on a case 3 weeks ago. Can you get us in headline news? What does that do to you if I send you or any of your reporters a press release on a decision that came down weeks ago?
Again, it's at that point, it's old news, right? I mean, we can't do a lot unless it's part of a trend and there's some way we can look at it. That's not useful to us. Immediacy really does matter. And also, we don't want to be the last one to, don't shop it to everyone else in town and then bring it to us.
Right. So that's 2 good ground rules: timeliness, I just heard, and being respectful of all the publications. And especially knowing your audience. If it's a Massachusetts story, shouldn't it be going to Massachusetts first and then elsewhere? What other ground rules can we set when speaking to a reporter? What should lawyers and their representatives be thinking about?
Well, one, to follow up on what you just said, which I think is an important point, is to give some thought to what the correct publication is for the story. We sometimes get press releases that are very generic, and it's clear they went to every single news organization. That's probably not going to be really successful. And so give some thought, and the story you pitch to a Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly or the Boston Globe are going to be really pretty different. And what fits for one audience doesn't fit for another. So if it's more technical and legal, maybe it's for us. If it's more human interest, maybe it's more for general circulation. But if you craft your pitch to fit the publication, that you're going to have more likelihood that you're going to have success and it's going to resonate with whoever you send it to. So I think that's a good ground rule.
That's music to my ears, by the way. And I'll tell you why. Oftentimes we'll get lawyers saying, well, why does it take you so long to issue a press release? Just BCC everyone. We have never just BCC'd a press release. It's always very specific why this is relevant to your outlet and your audience, what makes it different for that outlet and audience, because there's different reasons why it's important. And if you got something BCC'd, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, it's not one size fits all. I think that's exactly right. And sort of to follow on that point, the other thing is, and this is something where people like you really are incredibly helpful to us, is to help explain to law firms that everything isn't a story. Some of it is really more, frankly, marketing, and that's not really a news story. And so it needs to be something, and I'm sure this comes up for you all the time, where you're trying to explain, okay, that's not something that is going to be generally interesting to everyone else in the profession. You need to think about it from that perspective. And I sometimes go on calls with my editor or with a marketing person to visit firms and try to explain that difference, that everything isn't a story just because it matters to you and how your firm is performing.
And it's interesting that you say that, because even some of the things that used to be news have now become revenue streams under the new business model. So, for example, people in the news, we all know, or at least you and I know, it's always the most read section of a publication.
Exactly. Right.
Everybody wants to know what everybody else is doing, right? Most media outlets in business and B2B have made that a revenue generator in the last 5 years.
That's right. They're moving away from that being just part. That's exactly right.
So then it's really, part of our job is really explaining to our clients why the fact that you have this new partner, you have one lateral coming in one office, and why that's not going to get picked up anymore unless that person, was the CEO or, some high level executive or the managing office partner or managing partner, like those extra things. And so it's been really interesting. It's been a challenge on the PR side to have to really explain. And this is why we do these interviews, by the way. We want our audience to really understand the inner workings of the media so that they could be better sources of information, but also respect that it's still a business.
Exactly.
You have a business to run without revenue, like advertising revenue, subscribership, CLEs, all the different things that you do. You don't have a business. So,
right.
So then there would be no media outlet. So what are some of the best approaches if someone wanted to become a trusted media resource?
One of the best approaches, honestly, it can be to just reach out to, for my publication, me, the editor or me, or even one of the reporters and say, could we just grab a cup of coffee? And it's very informal. And you just sort of tell them what you do. This is my practice. These are the kinds of cases I have. These are the kinds of issues that come up in my practice that I think are important. And if you ever need a source, give me a call. And now reporters are always looking to have new voices, right? We're always looking to expand the list of potential people we can talk to. We don't want it to be the same people over and over again. You want to get all voices in the community. And now they have got your name and you've said, reach out to me and I'm willing to be helpful. But then if they call you, you need to be helpful, right? You don't want to be the person who didn't call back. And honestly, it's fine to get back to somebody and say, I actually can't really speak to this, but here's somebody else who can. That still makes you a great resource. It's when you don't return the call at all. That's very frustrating as a former reporter, because you don't know, then you just have to keep making call after call after call because you've got a deadline, you've got to talk to somebody. So being respectful of their time is sort of, as you said earlier, understand they've got a job to do and respond and either help if you can or point them in a different direction. And that sort of builds that relationship, what we talked about before. It's all about having a relationship.
And I like to tell people, even if you get their email and respond to an email, say, I received your voicemail, I'm on deadline for something. What is your deadline? Do you have specific questions that you plan to ask? Because I'd love to be able to help you, but I might not be able to do it right now. And sometimes I find that reporters will say, okay, I have 3 hours. Here's a question. Just get me a draft answer. And you're still having that, because I think we're less apt to pick up the phone today because of the amount of time and billable hours and so on and so forth. I'm not encouraging not picking up the phone, to be clear, but I also understand that everybody's under constant deadline. So ask, can we communicate via email? If you, as an attorney, are so inundated with other things, or don't hesitate also to say, I would love to be a resource to you. I can't do it today, but may I recommend? And recommend other people, because that's always being a good resource to media outlets as well, or at least that's my understanding. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. I think the important thing is to respond one way or another. If you can't do it because of time constraints, you say, I'd love to be a resource in the future. I can't get to it this time, but I suggest you call so-and-so. Respond and say, I can't talk today. Could we schedule a time tomorrow? It's being respectful of the request and giving some kind of response, even if it's, I can't do this for you. That's still building a relationship with someone who will get back to you, even if they can't be helpful for that particular story. And that's important.
And especially if you are not the best source, or it's not your area, or it's a case or you have a conflict, I have always found that that type of honesty is the best policy. This isn't my area of expertise, or, you know what, I'm conflicted out from answering that, so I'm going to pass on this one. And I've always found that reporters are very respectful of that.
I think that's right. I think getting the response, even if it's I can't help you, just fosters that give and take relationship of we're going to be upfront with each other.
So Susan, for now, we're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor.
This episode is brought to you by Rubel Communications. Recognized as the #1 agency by the National Law Journal, Rubel helps top businesses and law firms with high-stakes public relations and marketing, reputation management, crisis planning, and incident response, including high-profile litigation media relations. To learn more, go to furiarubel.com or email podcast@furiarubel.com.
So it's interesting. One of the things I had met with Hal Cohen, for our listeners, that's the CEO of Bridgetower Media. I've known Hal for many years. He's been in legal publishing for many years. And one of the first things I asked him is, we see all these publications by city, these legal publications, and really just trying to understand what your markets were in comparison to other markets, because it's a different publisher. And you don't typically have competing publications that are city or state niche legal.
That's right.
So it's important for our listeners to understand. And the same, by the way, for our listeners holds true with business journals. There are different publishers of business journals. It's not all one publisher in the whole country. So really understanding that is important when you're trying to choose, going back to choosing the right outlet and understanding the media within your city, state, region, industry practice area. So, which, we have to do all of that. So for the various publications under Bridgetower Media, how can our audience identify and pitch stories, ideas that will resonate with those reporters? What are some of the tips you have for them?
Other than just Massachusetts, just in some of the other brands?
Sure, just generally. So from a perspective of not necessarily Missouri or Michigan per se, but more, how do they focus that pitch so that you hear it?
I think it's a little of what we talked about earlier, which is thinking about who the best audience is for what you see as the story, and then finding the publication, and sometimes it's publications, but often it's one that is going to be the best fit for what the story is. So if it's a story about business trends, it's probably a business journal. If it's a story about a recent decision, you mentioned a Supreme Court decision before, legal might be the way to go. And think about who is this of most interest to, and that's what the publication you want to pitch it to. And then in the pitch, you explain, this is important because. So here is what happened. And this is why I think this is important to your readers, because you're kind of getting the reporter, that's the obvious first question. Well, why does it matter to me? You give that answer. It's important, and here's why. And that, that's the hook.
So how important are email headlines?
I think email headlines are pretty important because we all get a lot of email. And if you don't immediately know what the email is about, well, maybe you don't look at it right away. So I think the headline is really important. And I think in terms of the email, brevity is really important. Don't write a novel. You want to pretty succinctly say, here's the issue and here's why it's important, because reporters get a lot of email like everybody does. And human nature is to go to the ones that look like they're going to be the most promising.
What's funny? So I get to work on both sides of the fence because of the podcast. We're being pitched every day of people who want us to tell their stories. And one of my biggest pet peeves is that email that just in the headline, it says press release.
That's not really a grabber.
I just delete them. I'm like, yeah, great. You have a press release. Like, what is in this for my audience? Why does our audience care? How is it relevant? So I can't tell you how many people, it's interesting because the name of the podcast is On Record PR. So people will just assume that we'll put anyone on, but our primary target audience is law firms and business to business executives, right? So it's a very specific audience.
Mm-hmm.
It's a PR firm that does consumer products. Like, why would we have you on? So it's telling lawyers that we have to think about it. And I'm sure you remember when we were trained in advocacy in law school, we talked about you think about picking a jury, right? You're picking people who can hear and resonate with your message. That email subject line is so important, in my opinion, just, even from all the pitches I get. And it's got to be relevant.
I think it goes back to you have to understand the audience and you have to communicate why this matters to that audience. You have to do your research, really.
So a lot of what we're talking about is public relations, in particular, media relations. But Bridgetower Media does have a big set of offerings in terms of different ways that lawyers can raise their profiles. So going to the other side of the fence, whether it be, paid sponsorships, advertising dollars, things like that, what are the other opportunities? But before I get there, what is the policy at Bridgetower Media as it relates to, is there a wall between advertising and editorial? Like, how do you keep the two separate?
There is a wall. Editorial decides what we're going to cover. So that's an editorial decision. And what's going to be in the publication is decided by editorial. There are opportunities, though, that have an editorial component that are paid opportunities. Sponsored content's an example. Some of our special publications have an editorial component in that editorial works on them, works on compiling honorees, speaks at our events. It's not too different, not completely separate. There is a little bit of bleed, but in terms of deciding what is covered, that's an editorial decision. Over time, sponsored content is a newer phenomenon, right? That wasn't anything when I started out. But now there's a whole subset of content that is driven by the advertiser and not driven by editorial. And it's advertising in a content sense, as opposed to what we think of as traditional advertising, which is straight up ads.
But would any of the publications give preference to a story just because somebody was an advertiser?
No.
That's what I was trying to get at. And because oftentimes people say, well, we advertise there, they should run this story. I'm like, well, they're not going to.
No, it doesn't work that way. And in fact, we've run stories that are critical of advertisers. That's the way it goes. Then we're not being truthful with our readers if we're keeping stories from them or not pursuing things because there's an advertiser involved. We would lose all credibility.
So how can media companies, PR companies, and other agencies like ours, like Gina Rubel, work best with Bridgetower Media? And what do you wish we understood about your business?
I think that most PR companies and marketing folks do understand all that we've been talking about, that not everything is a story. There's free media and there's paid media and what fits in what bucket, but not everybody does. And I do wish I've certainly dealt with marketing people who were insistent, why can't you just do this story? Why can't you just do this story? Because it's not a story for the broader audience. So I would encourage your listeners to, listen to the advice they're getting from people like Gina. And what they're telling you is true. There are different types of media exposure. Some are paid, some aren't. Understand the difference. And, don't think that paid exposure is necessarily inferior, because it isn't. You could be speaking on a panel. You could be sponsoring an event. And there's a lot of exposure there that comes from a paid opportunity like that, being able to get up in front of a large crowd, talk about your business, talk about your firm. It's paid, but it's still valuable. The free isn't the only thing that's a good way to reach that audience. And you also, and more we talk about, you want to reach people in multiple channels. You want to be on the publication. You also want to be at their events. You want to be speakers on their panels. You want to reach that audience across all the different touch points so that you're raising your brand awareness and making people aware of your name more than just being in the publication.
So what are some of the trends you're seeing in the industry and how do they impact your business and the audience?
So one thing that's been happening for really the past maybe 5 or 6 years and is still continuing to happen is that you're losing those firms that are purely local in their presence. If the good sized firm that's a Boston-based firm and doesn't have offices elsewhere. And more you're seeing firms that are Midwest firms having offices in the Northeast, having offices on the West Coast. Southeast firms now having an office in Boston. Boston firms now opening an office in the Midwest. And firms are becoming much more national, or at least regional, and much less specific to just a certain state. And that, frankly, puts some firms that don't do that probably at a little bit of a disadvantage. Now, firms do that in a couple of ways. Sometimes they come in and they poach a couple of people from a local firm and they set up kind of an outpost. But sometimes they come in and they really want to build a presence because they really want to stake a claim in that market and they're looking for lateral talent. That's continuing to happen. It's been happening this year with firms that never had a Boston presence suddenly do. Another thing I'll mention is this is a post-pandemic, is getting people back in the office. So law firms, you remember, I'm sure from practice, being in the office every day, all day, that's what you did. That's what everybody did. Very important to be seen by the partners, to be seen to be working late. Pandemic hits, and all of a sudden, law firms, like everybody else, have people working from home. And for a long time, I think the firms were really reluctant to make people come back. And what I'm seeing certainly in this market here is that seems to have turned a corner. And I'm hearing more and more from firms and from partners. We need people in the office. They're concerned about training. They're concerned about mentoring. And how do you really train folks? And specifically in a litigation practice, the most recent person I was talking to, you really can't do that over Zoom. How do you really train folks? How do you really mentor the next group of who are going to be leaders in the community if it's all remote? The problem they're running into is that a lot of these people were students during COVID and they weren't in class. They took their classes remotely and it doesn't feel natural to them. But it's a real push-pull. And I'm hearing a lot of firms saying, you know what, we have to have people back. We're losing a lot without having that collegiality and being able to stick your head in a partner's office and ask them a question.
You know, it's interesting. That's a whole nother podcast and it's a whole nother topic because it is so firm and culture dependent. There are many firms running really successful practices where they are almost still fully virtual, but they're using all sorts of digital platforms and they're outfitting home offices. And then there are others that are back to office, 6 days a week. And I think, my gut is it's going to play out very decisively based on the culture of the individuals that they're recruiting. And it's not a benefit either way if somebody doesn't perceive it as a benefit. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents. I have clients who are 2 days of the week in the office and everybody's thriving and they're more profitable than ever and more productive and people are happier. So who knows? I do think, however, just since you're in Boston and I'm outside of Philadelphia, I do think the Northeast is driving a lot of the return to office, the RTO, as you will, mindset. But that's very common with Boston, New York, Philadelphia, DC, in leading that more, not necessarily conservative view from a political perspective, but this is the way it should be done and has always been done. So it's going to be interesting to see.
It is going to be interesting to see because you're right. Law is a traditional profession and there is a lot of that. This is how it's always been done. We were always in the office together, working together on things. And there's a resistance to seeing that change for sure.
Oh, huge, especially with support staff. It's going to become so difficult to get great support staff if there's not some level of flexibility.
And you do run into issues sometimes where, you want to make sure that the rules are the same for everybody. If the lawyers don't have to be in all the time, it becomes even harder to say to your support staff, well, you've got to be here 5 days a week. But because, the kind of work we do, we can work remotely. And that doesn't really build that team approach.
No, there's no team in that either. So that's interesting. I think we're seeing a lot of the same trends. I think also really trying to navigate the new laws of the land, as you will, and how the Supreme Court is coming down and how each of those things affects the law firms, whether it be affirmative action or Roe v. Wade or any of these decisions, same-sex marriage. It affects how these firms not only counsel their clients, but how they run their own companies.
Well, that's exactly right, because their firms are employers too. So all of these issues that are issues for employers, DE&I programs, there was a decision on how you handle religious accommodations. Well, those apply to the law firms themselves with their own employees, in addition to how they counsel their clients. The other thing I was going to mention, of course, which is what everybody talks about these days, is AI and how, AIs. I mean, every day I read a new story about AI and legal, and you've got lawyers getting in trouble for filing briefs that have cases that aren't real cases because they weren't vetted. You've got judges in some jurisdictions telling lawyers they've got to certify that a human being looked at these filings and said these are real cases. And it's very interesting because it clearly can save work. It clearly can do some of that. I mean, remember document review? And now we have, with e-discovery tools, you can really cull through, and all those man hours that I know I spent and the paralegals spent going through those documents. But the law is so much about people pay us for our judgment, right? They pay us for our knowledge and our judgment, and we can't really turn that over to an algorithm.
It's so true. I do generative AI policy training for law firms and have been doing CLEs all over the country because so many of them don't know even how to roll out generative AI use or non-use in their firms, don't know how it affects their business, don't know the IP issues. I mean, there's just a lot of issues. And yet, with a policy and training, they can be used in a very useful way. Mm-hmm. But you don't want to be the law firm, and I will not mention the name on our podcast. When I last looked in June, I did an analysis. They had over 750 media hits on filing a false brief with content from generative AI, i.e. ChatGPT, and had over $12 million worth of media coverage, had they had paid for it, of negative coverage because of, I'm not going to mention the firm, but it's that New York case that created this. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we all came to the conclusion that how does a lawyer go to court with a brief that wasn't
right, that wasn't vetted?
It wasn't vetted. It wasn't shepherdized. It'd be like saying taking a law student, having them write your brief and not double checking the citations. I mean, it falls on the lawyers, but it's a good reason to understand why generative AI is such an important topic right now and why it is trending in the industry and why reporters are talking about it.
Right. There are obviously enormous possibilities, but there's also a lot of risks there. And it goes beyond just what we talked about, but there's privacy issues, there's copyright issues, there's issues with hiring. It can come up for law firms or their clients if there's some implicit bias that's bleeding into it because of the use of an algorithm to screen resumes. It seems all very shiny and exciting, but there's absolutely some concerns there.
I wrote one of the first articles for a trade publication. I'll link to it. It covers all of those risks. And if you have any articles that you would like us to link to in the transcript or the show notes, please feel free to send them because we have a whole generative AI resource center on our website for law firms. And we're linking back to content that you've published as well as other outlets because it's just such an important topic right now. So it's as important today as all of the, work from office, protecting your employees was in 2020 during the pandemic. So just another trend. We're not writing about the pandemic anymore, but we're certainly writing about generative AI. So for our listeners, if you could give them one tip, one thing about working with Bridgetower Media publications, what would that be?
I think all the publications in Bridgetower, and we have business vertical, we have construction vertical, we have legal vertical, we have home furnishings. All of these are really parts of the community. We all see ourselves as, we're not newspapers, we're not just publications, but we do events, we put on programs, we provide thought leadership. And if you think of us that way, is that we're part of the community with you. Lawyers Weekly is part of the community here in Boston, and in all the other states we have Lawyers Weekly papers. And think about it, to go back to something I said earlier, as working with us. We're partners. Yes, we have clients. Yes, we have advertisers, but we see it as a partnership, and we see us as working together so everybody's successful. We run a business, you run a business. We can work together to make everybody successful. And I've been with the company for a long time. We have some other people with a lot of longevity. And it's those personal relationships that kind of make it work. And so if you think of us as a partner and someone that you're going to work with long term, and that what we're looking to do is we're not just going to take your money. We want to work with you. We want to work with you, and we want to make you more successful. And you think of us the same way, that we are working towards a common goal.
I love that. So in the show notes to our listeners, I will have contact information for Susan so that you can reach out to her. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, Susan. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to On Record PR. Visit our website, onrecordpr.com, to subscribe to the show, share it with your friends on social media, find show notes, additional episodes, and more information. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, feel free to send us questions or show ideas at podcast@onrecordpr.com.